Welcome back to the Deep Dive. It is great to have you with us. Today, we are walking straight into what I can only describe as a minefield. And I don't say that lightly.
No, a minefield is probably the most accurate description. We're tackling education.
Mm,
Specifically, we're tackling the concept of school choice. And if you have ever brought this up at, a dinner party or a school board meeting,
Right.
or even just casually with neighbors, you know that the temperature in the room usually jumps about 10 degrees instantly.
it really does. It is one of those topics where absolutely everyone has an opinion, and usually that opinion is forged in fire.
Exactly.
It's emotional, it's heavily political, and people tend to rely on anecdotes. You know the drill. My neighbor's kid had a terrible time at a charter, or my cousin's private school saved his life.
Exact. It's a debate driven by feelings and personal stories, but that is exactly why today is going to be different. Our mission on this deep dive is to sort of cut the wire on those emotions. We are not here to debate the politics. We're not here to validate anyone's feelings or preconceived notions. We are here to look strictly at the findings.
Right. We are stripping away the noise.
Mm.
We are working from a comprehensive review of the research by Herbert J. Wahlberg titled simply School Choice, The Findings.
Mhm.
And what I love about this source material is that Wahlberg isn't writing an op-ed. He isn't standing on a soapbox. He is aggregating the most rigorous science, available peer-reviewed studies, economic data, the hard numbers.
And he really casts a wide net. When we say school choice, people usually think of one thing, maybe vouchers, maybe charters.
Right.
But the source material covers the entire ecosystem. Charter schools, vouchers, private schools, and something that I found fascinating, the market effects of competition on the system itself.
That last part is key. It is not just about where the kid goes to school. It is about what happens to the schools when they have to compete for that kid.
Oh,
But before we get into the weeds of the mechanisms, let's set the stakes.
we should.
Because the source material starts with a context that is actually pretty jarring.
It is a contrast that should keep people up at night. Wahlberg points out that if you look at the United States on the global stage, we are the undisputed heavyweight champion. We lead in wealth, we lead in military power, we lead in cultural influence.
And higher education, right. I mean, our universities, Harvard, Stanford, MIT, are the envy of the world.
Absolutely. We dominate scientific discovery and university-level research. But, and this is a massive but, when you zoom in on K-12 education, that picture flips completely. The source argues that compared to other economically advanced nations, our K-12 system is lagging dangerously behind. We are effectively losing ground in both effectiveness, how much kids actually learn, and efficiency, how much it costs to teach them.
This leads us to the first major concept we need to unpack, the productivity problem. I think the average person assumes that if schools are struggling, the answer is simple arithmetic. We just need to write a bigger check.
That is the standard assumption. But the data presents what we call the cost versus result paradox. If you look at the last few decades, inflation-adjusted spending per student in the U.S. hasn't just gone up a little bit. It has risen substantially. We are pouring more resources into the system than ever before.
So the inputs are skyrocketing. We're paying more.
Exactly. But the output student achievement have remained flat or, in some metrics, even declined.
If this were a business, the shareholders would have fired the CEO a long time ago.
You wouldn't just have a revolt, you would be bankrupt. I mean, think about it. In any other industry, technology, manufacturing, agriculture, if you increased your capital investment that drastically, you would expect a better product or a cheaper product.
Sure.
In U.S. education, we have achieved the opposite. A more expensive product that works about the same or worse.
There's a specific statistic in the source material from Harvard economist Caroline Hawksby that honestly made my jaw drop. We need to unpack this. She tried to put a hard number on this productivity drop.
This is one of those numbers that forces you to stop and reread the page. Hawksby calculated the productivity of U.S. public schools defined, technically as student achievement divided by spending.
Right.
She found that between 1971 and 1999, the productivity of U.S. public schools fell by somewhere between 55 and 73%.
73%. That is staggering. A 70% drop in productivity.
It basically means we're getting significantly less bang for our buck with every passing decade. And it pairs with another trend the source identifies called the value-added crisis.
Explain that concept for us.
So when American kids enter the system at kindergarten, first grade, they actually stack up pretty well internationally. We aren't starting from behind.
Right.
But the longer they stay in the U.S. system, the further they fall behind their peers in places like Asia or Europe. By the time they finish high school, we are lagging behind most of the OECD countries. The system isn't adding value. Relative to the world, it is actually acting like a brake.
And I want to connect this to the so what for the listener, because this isn't just about test scores or national pride. The force connects this directly to the future of the economy.
It's the human capital argument. In 1950s, a company's value was mostly physical factories, machinery, land. Today, in the modern economy, intangible assets, skills, knowledge, patents, know-how make up about 70% of a company's value.
Wow.
So if the schools aren't producing that human capital,
Then the engine of the economy eventually stalls. If there is a disconnect between what the economy needs, high-level critical thinking and skills, and what the schools are delivering, we are looking at a talent gap that could eventually undermine that wealth and military dominance we talked about at the start.
that's the fear.
Okay, so we have established a pretty grim baseline. High cost, low productivity, and a system that seems to get less efficient the more money we feed it.
Right.
The source material suggests the solution isn't more money, but structure, specifically choice. Let's start with the most visible form of this, charter schools.
Right. This is usually the entry point for most people when they think about this topic.
First, just to define our terms for everyone, charters are public schools. They are funded by taxpayers.
That's the key point.
But they don't answer to the standard school district bureaucracy.
Correct. They operate under a charter, a contract, that grants them autonomy in how they teach and operate in exchange for accountability regarding results. If they don't perform, their charter can be revoked.
Which is a very different dynamic than a traditional neighborhood school, which basically exists in perpetuity regardless of performance.
Exactly. And if you want to know if people want this, just look at the demand. The source highlights that in places like Massachusetts, the wait lists for charter schools have been massive, totaling 55% of their total enrollment.
That means for every 2 kids sitting in a charter classroom, there is another one standing outside hoping a spot opens up.
And because most charters are oversubscribed, they have to use blind lotteries to admit students. The source emphasizes this as a signal of pent-up demand.
People are desperate.
Parents are desperate to find alternatives. They are essentially voting with their feet.
But here is the skeptical question. Are they voting for something better? Or is it just the grass is greener syndrome? Does the data actually show charters work?
That's the core question.
The source spends a lot of time on a study by Caroline Hawksby regarding charter achievement.
This is a crucial study because it addresses the biggest criticism of charter research. Often, critics will pick a few failing charters and say, see, they don't work, or they use a tiny sample size.
Right.
Hawksby's study was different. It was a single point-in-time snapshot, but it covered 99% of the nation's charter schools.
99%. So there's basically a census.
Pretty close. She wasn't cherry-picking. And she compared the students in these charters to students in the matched public schools they would have otherwise attended. This is crucial for an apples-to-apples comparison.
Okay, so what did she find?
She found that charter students were, on average, 5.2% more likely to be proficient in reading and 3.2% more likely in math compared to their peers in the traditional schools.
That sounds positive, but maybe modest.
It might sound modest at first glance, but you have to peel back the layers. The source highlights the time factor. The study found that the longer a charter school has been in operation, the better the results. For schools that had been operating for 9 to 11 years, that proficiency advantage in reading jumped to 10.1%.
So there is a learning curve for the schools themselves. They get better over time.
Absolutely. Like any startup, new schools have kinks to work out. But once they stabilize, they significantly outperform. And here's where it gets really interesting regarding equality. The study found that poor and Hispanic students showed particularly strong performance in charters compared to their peers in traditional schools.
Now, I have seen headlines that say the opposite, that charters lag behind. The source mentions studies by the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, and the NCES that claim charters are actually worse. How do we reconcile that?
Right. The source material is pretty critical of those negative studies, primarily on methodological grounds.
How so?
The argument is that the AFT and NCES studies use small, unrepresentative samples. They relied on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP, which only surveys about 3% of all schools.
So when you slice that 3% to find charters, you are looking at a tiny, tiny fragment.
You are looking at a drop of water and trying to map the ocean. Hawksby was looking at the ocean itself. The source argues that when you look at the universe of data, the advantage clearly goes to charters.
Let's talk about the ripple effect. There is this fear that if you have charters, they will drain the good kids and the money from traditional public schools, leaving them worse off. It is the cream skimming argument.
That is the common fear. But the economic theory suggests the opposite. Competition should force everyone to improve, and the data from Michigan and Arizona states that were early adopters with high charter penetration backs that up.
What did it show?
Hawksby found that when traditional public schools faced significant competition, meaning they were losing over 6% of their enrollment to charters, their own test scores went up.
Wait, so the traditional public schools got better when they lost students?
Yes, it's the rising tide theory. When a monopoly is threatened, it has to innovate. It has to become more efficient. If a principal knows that parents can leave and are leaving, they have to focus on customer service.
They have to compete.
They have to compete. The source argues that competition forced the traditional schools to stop being complacent.
That is fascinating. It is not just about the kids in the charter schools. It is about the pressure applied to the whole system.
And we have to remember the context of fairness here. Charter schools are achieving these results while doing more with less.
How much less?
On average, charter schools receive about 21.7% less funding per pupil than traditional public schools. They also don't get funding for facilities usually, so they are outperforming the traditional system while operating on a significantly tighter budget.
Okay, let's pivot to the next big topic in the source material, vouchers. This is where the government gives parents the money that would have been spent on their child in a public school and allows them to use it for private school tuition.
This is even more controversial than charters, but from a research perspective, it offers something unique: the gold standard of data.
Why is voucher research considered the gold standard? Explain that.
Because usually in social science, it is hard to compare groups because people self-select. But because voucher programs are often oversubscribed, they use lotteries. That creates a randomized field trial, just like in medicine. You have a treatment group, the lottery winners who get the voucher, and a control group, the lottery losers who stay in public school. The only difference between them is luck. That makes the comparison remarkably clean.
So it's a real experiment.
It's as close as you can get.
Okay, so looking at these randomized trials, the source mentions New York City, Dayton, Washington, D.C. What does the gold standard data tell us?
The findings are very specific. Researchers found a significant African-American advantage. African-American students who used vouchers to attend private schools scored significantly higher, about 9 percentile points higher in math and reading than the control group left behind in public schools.
9 percentile points is a pretty massive jump.
It is huge in educational research. That is enough to significantly close the racial achievement gap.
But what about white students?
That is the white student puzzle mentioned in the source. In these same studies, white students didn't show those same dramatic gains.
Why the difference?
The source suggests a few possibilities. It could be a ceiling effect. Maybe those students were already scoring higher, so there was less room to grow.
Okay, that makes sense.
Or it could be that the public schools serving white populations were relatively better than the inner city schools serving African-American students, so the contrast with the private school wasn't as sharp. But the key point the expert emphasizes is that no group performed worse. At worst, it was a wash. At best, it was a life-changing improvement.
I want to touch on one specific voucher program mentioned that seems to have a totally different dynamic. The McKay Scholarship in Florida. This is for special needs students.
This is a powerful part of the source material. The McKay program allows students with disabilities to take their funding to a private school, and the satisfaction gap here is stunning.
How stunning.
90% of McKay parents reported being satisfied with their chosen school, compared to only about 33% of special needs parents in the traditional system.
That is a massive gap, 33 to 90.
And it is not just about academics, it is about safety. The source cites a striking drop in reported bullying.
Really?
Yes. In the public schools, bullying and physical assault were major concerns for these families. When they moved to private schools using the vouchers, reports of bullying dropped dramatically. For these kids, choice wasn't just about test scores, it was about well-being.
One of the biggest arguments against vouchers is that they lead to segregation. The idea that we will end up with schools divided by race and class. Does the data support that?
The source calls this the segregation myth. The evidence from D.C., Cleveland, and Milwaukee actually shows the opposite. Voucher students often moved into less segregated environments in the public schools they left.
How is that possible?
Because many urban public schools are racially isolated due to housing patterns.
Right, the whole neighborhood school model.
Exactly. Private schools often draw from a wider geographic area and reflect the broader community better than a neighborhood-based public school in a segregated neighborhood. The source notes that private schools in these programs were consistently less racially isolated than the public sector.
We should also briefly look abroad. The U.S. isn't the only place doing this.
Right. The source points to Sweden and the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, for example, the majority of schools are private but publicly funded. They found that universal vouchers led to increased competition and achievement without the social divisiveness people fear.
So it can work at a national scale.
It suggests that the U.S. model of school assigned by zip code is actually the outlier.
Let's move on to the third pillar here. Private schools in general. The source makes a strong efficiency argument here.
This goes back to the productivity problem. Private schools operate at roughly 55 to 66% of the cost of public schools per pupil.
Wait, really? I think we all imagine private schools as these incredibly expensive elite institutions.
That is the stereotype, the Andover or Exeter. But the vast majority of private schools are religious or independent community schools that operate on a shoestring compared to the public district budgets. The source points out that if we could achieve the same results at 60% of the cost,
The savings would be enormous.
the savings to the taxpayer would be in the billions.
But are they achieving the same results? Or are they just cheaper?
The data suggests they are achieving better results, particularly in what the source calls civic values.
This is another counterintuitive point. People assume private religious schools are enclaves of intolerance.
Exactly. But the data says otherwise. The Campbell study mentioned in the text showed that Catholic and private school students often score higher on tolerance and political tolerance scales than public school students.
Why would that be?
The theory is that private schools often have a clearer, more cohesive moral mission. They explicitly teach values. The data also showed higher rates of volunteering, civic engagement, and public speaking among private school graduates.
Interesting.
The Latino National Political Survey found that Latinos educated in private schools were significantly more tolerant of political disagreement than those in public schools.
So the idea that public schools are the melting pot, creating good citizens, and private schools are isolated kids, isn't backed by the numbers in the source.
Not according to these findings. And on the academic side, there is the issue of elite access. Even though private schools are only about 11% of the population, their graduates made up 41% of freshmen at elite universities like Yale, Princeton, and Stanford.
Wow.
Now, you can argue that is selection bias, wealthier families. But the gap is so large that it suggests a significant value add in preparation.
Okay, we have covered the types of schools, but Section 4 of our deep dive outlines something called the geography of choice. This is about how the system is organized.
This gets into the economics of systemic competition. Have you ever heard of the tie-bout effect?
I have not. Unpack that for us.
Charles Tie-Bout was an economist who theorized that people vote with their feet. If you have a lot of small local governments or school districts near each other, people will move to the one that offers the best services for the lowest taxes. It creates natural competition.
So if I live in a city with 20 different small school districts, I can move 2 towns over if the schools are better.
Exactly. And the source uses the Herfindahl Index, which is a way economists measure monopoly power, to look at school districts.
What's the finding?
The finding is that areas with more districts, meaning less concentration, more fragmentation, tend to have higher test scores. Competition between districts drives quality.
But haven't we been doing the opposite in the U.S. consolidating districts?
We have. Over the last century, we went from about 119,000 school districts down to about 15,000. We consolidated in the name of efficiency and economies of scale.
But the source calls this the bigger is not better fallacy.
Right, because in education, economies of scale are often outweighed by coordination costs. Huge bureaucracies become unresponsive. The source compares Montana to places like NYC or Chicago. Montana has many tiny locally funded districts. They consistently rank near the top in achievement.
And the big ones.
Meanwhile, massive centralized districts like Chicago were struggling with reading proficiency rates as low as 14% for fourth graders.
14%.
Yes. The argument is that when a district gets that big, it becomes a monopoly that is too far removed from the parents and students to be effective.
This links to the funding issue, too. Local versus state funding.
Caroline Hawksby had another interesting finding here on New Hampshire. She found that schools relying on local funding, meaning they were directly accountable to local homeowners and taxpayers, performed better.
And when it's state funding?
When funding is centralized at the state level, that accountability link is broken. The school administration looks to the state capital for approval, not the local parents.
Which brings us perfectly to our final section, the customer. In this case, the parents and the students.
The source material highlights a massive satisfaction gap. They contrast the views of the producers, the educators, and the consumers, the families.
Give us the numbers on that.
There was a survey where 76% of superintendents said their students were graduating ready for high school.
Okay.
But only 54% of teachers agreed. And when you ask the parents, especially in inner cities, satisfaction plummets.
So the people running the system think it's going fine, but the people using the system disagree.
Precisely. And critics often argue that parents don't know how to choose. They say parents will just pick schools based on sports or convenience.
Right.
But the survey data refutes that. Parents consistently list academic quality as their #1 reason for choosing a school.
And when they do get to choose,
Satisfaction soars. In choice programs, charters, or vouchers, the very satisfied rates jump from about 57% in assigned schools to around 75% in choice schools.
the ultimate signal of dissatisfaction has to be homeschooling, though.
Absolutely. At the time of this source, there were 1.1 million homeschooled kids. That is a huge market signal. Think about the sacrifice involved there.
Oh, for sure.
Parents are paying taxes for a free service worth thousands of dollars, and then choosing to forgo that, often giving up a salary to stay home and do it themselves.
You don't make that sacrifice if the product you're being offered for free is high quality.
Exactly. It is a vote of no confidence in the status quo.
So let's bring this all together. We have gone through a lot of data. Charters, vouchers, private schools, market effects. If we look at the scorecard provided by Wahlberg in Table 7-on-1, what is the verdict?
The source is unequivocal. It runs through the scorecard achievement, efficiency, satisfaction, social integration across all forms of choice.
Yeah.
The source claims that the evidence supports every positive effect of choice. In some cases, the evidence is suggestive. In many, it is conclusive. But in no case did the choice model perform worse than the monopoly model.
So Wahlberg's conclusion is that the U.S. is essentially operating a monopoly in education. And like all monopolies, it has become expensive, inefficient, and unresponsive to its customers.
Right. And the proposed solution isn't just private schools or privatization. It is the introduction of competition. The argument is that we need to break the monopoly to lift the performance of the entire system. Just like FedEx forced the post office to improve, choice forces traditional schools to focus on results.
It really challenges you to look at your own local school district differently. Is it responsive? Is it efficient? Or is it just the only game in town?
That is the question. And here is a final provocative thought to leave you with, something the source implies but doesn't explicitly ask.
Okay.
If the data on efficiency, satisfaction, and achievement is this strong, if we know we could get better results for less money and happier parents,
Right.
why is the resistance to choice so incredibly high?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question. It seems there is a massive disconnect between what the producers of education want and what the consumers need.
And until that gap is closed, the productivity problem we started with isn't going away.
A lot to think about. That is a wrap for this deep dive into school choice. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you on the next one.